half of our Foundations of American Democracy lectures. We'll get through this relatively quickly today, and this should be relatively familiar from both U.S. history last year in class and some of the readings that you've already done in class this year. So this is just to make sure you're up on it. As I said earlier in the year, we're not going to do a quiz on this chapter, but it is fair game for the final. So just keep that in mind as you're taking notes, which remember are available online on both Teams and Classroom. So make sure you're using those, and also you've got the paper copies as well. So you've got options. Anyway, here we go. If you remember last time, we finished off talking about how terrible the Confederation's Congress was and how much Shays' Rebellion freaked everybody out, because if a bad thing happened in one state under the Articles of Confederation, what was going to stop that from sort of spreading into other states? And the answer was not a whole heck of a lot. So, May 25th, 1787, 12 of 13 states, Rhode Island being the exception because it's tiny and has an inferiority complex and it's angry and it doesn't want any of its power taken away and yada, yada, yada. Rhode Island is being Rhode Island. Send representatives to Philadelphia to figure something out. The initial plan was just, hey, maybe we can fix the Articles of Confederation. It becomes very clear very quickly that that's not going to be the case. These delegates are all from basically the same group. That is to say, they are all white males, somewhere between the age of, with a couple exceptions, about 25 and about 55. There's Ben Franklin in there who's noticeably older than that. It's also worth noting that all these guys are doing very well for themselves. George Washington is elected to run the convention, but that run is in quotes there for a reason. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are actually going to run the show, but they're seen as a little too upstart is the wrong word, but they're seen as maybe taking this a little bit for granted that it's their show. So everybody agrees that George Washington is the guy to do it. Everybody respects George Washington. So he's going to be sort of the manager. And if you remember from U.S. history last year, that was always his biggest asset as the leader of the Continental Army during the Revolution, was that he managed very, very well. So he's going to do this, but he's going to give the actual day-to-day issues to Madison and Hamilton to deal with. These guys are Federalists to the core. They found the Federalist Party. They are all about it. So make sure you get this down. Federalism stands for a strong central government, states that can govern themselves, but answer to a central government. We remember this from Chapter 2. We remember this from reading Fed 10 last week. Or you're continuing to read Fed 10. Either way. But proponents of federalism, strong central government, states still have control over themselves, but if it comes down to it at the end of the day, the federal government's going to tell the states what to do. We will talk about this in depth later on when we go over the Constitution after the election this year. Thomas Jefferson, kind of the other big name of early America we're not hearing much about here. He's in Paris as the United States representative to Paris, and he is not a fan of this. Jefferson is an anti-federalist, which we will talk about soon. But anti-federalists, just think of it as they're way more in favor of a confederal form of government. But we'll, like I said, get there in a second. So there are basically a couple different models that various people are throwing out there at the Constitutional Convention for how this new government should be set up. How should we create a legislative branch that can actually do something? So the crux of these next three things we're going to talk about all have to deal with the legislative branch, so Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. The first option here is the Virginia Plan, floated by the delegates from Virginia, which is the biggest and most populous state, so keep that in mind as we talk about this. I refer to this as the Big Baller Plan because it is loud, it is obnoxious, but it's very clear-cut on what it wants to do. So they're going to offer up a bicameral legislature. Bi, as we remember from any English class we've ever taken, means two. Cameral, in this case, is going to mean houses. So he's offering up two houses for the legislature. But both houses would have their representatives determined by state population. So both of these would be like the House of Representatives now. So if we think about this, Virginia being the biggest, most populous state at the time, New York and Pennsylvania are right behind it. Those states would dominate both houses of this bicameral legislature being proposed by the Virginia Plan. So if you're a tiny state, you're kind of toast here. But if you're a big state, you are clearly going to be able to run the show in House 1 and House 2. House A, House B, whatever you want to call it. So The Virginia plan favors the big states. It is the big baller plan. They want the big states to have the most control. They're very, very close to that idea that we talked about earlier of a more direct democracy, of the people playing a more direct role in all of this. So everything here would essentially come down to a popular vote. On the other side, the little guys, the New Jersey plan. We're going to call it the Kawhi Leonard plan because it is not particularly inspiring, but it is very fundamentally sound, and it will do what you ask of it. So, the New Jersey plan for the small states is going to propose a unicameral legislature. One. So only one house in this legislature. All states are going to get the same number of representatives, no matter if it is tiny little Rhode Island or massive Virginia. It doesn't matter. They're each going to get the same number of representatives. So in this case, it's very clearly going to favor small states. Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island. They're going to like this because they get the exact same voice as the big boys that proposed the Virginia plan. Now, hopefully you're thinking about this and being like, well, I'm pretty positive that both houses in the United States Congress now don't both use proportional representation, and I'm pretty sure both of them aren't set at the same number of representatives per state. So, how do we fix this problem? And the answer is the Connecticut Compromise. I call this the Kevin Durant Compromise, to continue my basketball analogy, because it's not the coolest move out there. There's probably other better ways to do this, but you know what? It won, and it won big, and it won big repeatedly. This is usually called the Connecticut Compromise. Sometimes people call it the Great Compromise as well. I'd prefer you to think of it as the Connecticut Compromise, which is another reason I put Kevin in there, because Kevin and Connecticut, both have that sound. It was proposed by Roger Sherman, who maybe you remember by helping Jefferson edit the Declaration of Independence. This is Roger Sherman. This is me pointing at a statue of Roger Sherman. I went to Philadelphia a couple years ago and went to the Constitution Center, because that's how I do, and demanded that this picture be taken. So that's Roger Sherman. He's the reason Congress is the way it is. Good for Roger Sherman. So Roger Sherman is going to split the difference here. He's going to take the good ideas from both the Virginia and the New Jersey plan and mush them together and create the American political system as we know it. So he's going to say, yes, that idea of a bicameral legislature is a good idea. We are going to create what is called an upper house, or the Senate, and there's going to be 2 members per state, no matter how big or how small the state, and they're going to serve for 6-year terms. Now, on the other hand, we have a second house here. We're going to call this the lower house, and this will be the House of Representatives. And that will be proportional to the population. The more people you have living in your state, the more people you get to send to the House of Representatives. And they are only going to serve for 2 years. Now, I will tell you this now, but we will go over it again in way more detail later. So hopefully, when we get around to our Constitution chapter, you'll be like, oh, right, Polking talked about that back in the beginning of October. The reason for the Senate having 6 years is the powers given to the Senate are going to revolve around more long-term impact things. So that will be like, international agreements are kind of a big one, or appointments, be that cabinet positions, federal judges, whatever. So they need to be able to have the job security to kind of look down the line a little bit and make an uncomfortable decision that they view as best for the people. The House of Representatives are going to get this real short leash of only 2 years, because they're going to be given the power eventually to write all the tax laws in the country. And so, as those of you with jobs are aware, and those of you without jobs will soon find out, paying taxes is not super fun. And as a result, if you all of a sudden get a massive tax bill, you want to be able to show your displeasure, perhaps, to your representative. And the best way to show your displeasure to a representative for passing a bad tax bill is to give them the rope and tug them off stage. So the idea here is that with only 2 years, if they whiff and your representative signs up for a bad tax policy or does something else that you don't like, they're not there long enough to do much damage, and you can vote them out of office within 2 years. So that's the Connecticut Compromise. We smush the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan together to get a bicameral legislature, one house with equal representation, one house with proportional representation. Moving on. That is not the only compromise in this case, though. There are a couple other ones that we definitely need to talk about. So the first one is the Three-Fifths Compromise, which thankfully is no longer an issue, but was a major issue in American history for a long time, and it needs to be addressed. And that is the Three-Fifths Compromise. The southern states wanted all of their populace counted, be they free people or enslaved, but only is it counted for proportional representation in the House of Representatives. They did not want it when it came to taxes. So they didn't want all the slaves to have to pay taxes on the income that they generated for their owners. So definitely an example of the South trying to have its cake and eat it too. The North said no, only free men. This was largely done to accelerate the decline of slavery, but it was also just a smart political move to say, well, if you're not going to let these people vote, why should we count them? So what ends up happening that nobody is particularly pleased with, but the South probably gets the better deal out of it in the end, is that slaves will count as 60%, as 3/5 of a person when determining population. This is going to help out the largely agricultural South, boost its numbers in the House of Representatives, and cause a lot of trouble for a lot of years as a result. But we get the Three-Fifths Compromise. Then we get the Commerce Clause, which is next. This says Congress can only regulate international and interstate, which means, so inter, I-N-T-E-R, is between, intra, I-N-T-R-A, is within. So there was a fear here that Congress was going to try to regulate trade within states, and this was agreed to, that Congress can only regulate international and interstate commerce. So whatever happens in a state, as long as it remains there, is not the purview of Congress. The South was afraid that this was going to result in the outlawing of the slave trade and threw a giant fit. And so what ended up happening was the Constitutional Convention agreed that they would not be able to pass any laws outlawing slavery for 25 years after the passage of this bill. However, after that, they could. And the South said, well, that'll maybe give us the next time to figure out our own slavery stuff. Of course, they didn't. But in the early 1800s, the importation of slaves is outlawed, and the slave trade is otherwise left untouched in the American South. But this will result in the Commerce Clause, which we talk about later, which is going to give the federal government a whole heck of a lot of input on what is going to happen as things cross any borders. So if something worth money crosses a border, the federal government gets to get involved, be that the border between, Montana and Idaho, or, the international border with us taking in, products that we bought from China at the port of San Diego, whatever. So then the question arises, all right, we've got a good legislature. How do we make sure that putting in a president, we don't get a tyranny? If we elect only one person to be president as opposed to a panel of presidents, isn't that going to be a recipe for disaster where, if we take this, which I believe is a screenshot from an Assassin's Creed game, what's to stop George Washington or whoever else gets elected from just taking all the power for themselves? If we just put a committee together, on the other hand, and tried to make it so they didn't just have one person in power, to expand the sphere, right, if we're using a term from Federalist 10, are they going to get anything done, or are they just going to argue with each other? Then the question comes up, should the president be elected by a popular vote? So should we let everybody in the country vote for the president? Doesn't that give bigger states more of an input? But also, wouldn't that be more fair because the president would be ruling over everybody? And then lastly, should we just let Congress do this? And the answer is this, the Electoral College. It is kind of a compromise answer that seems like it'll fix the problems on paper. As for in practice, that remains up to debate for this very day. So you draw your own conclusions on that. But here's what's going to happen. Each state gets to choose a body of electors, of people that will heed the popular vote within the state, but make the ultimate call themselves. So you're going to choose people that are of an upstanding nature. So you want your community leaders, your people that have experience in politics before, that sort of thing, and familiarity with the issues. So your elector is not going to be somebody out from the boonies in Western Pennsylvania. If you're from Pennsylvania, it's probably going to be some people from Philadelphia and the middle of the state. Maybe one elector is going to speak up for the people outside of the big cities. But for the most part, the electors are there to speak up for all of the people and what all of the people want. And then these electors will be given their marching orders by the people, and they will vote for the president that they deemed best. Now, this is important here because electors technically have the ability to not vote for the person that won the vote in their state. So, for example, this did not happen last time because this barely never happens, but let's use Montana as an example. Donald Trump wins the 2016 election in Montana, right? You're nodding your head. Yes, good job. You remember the 2016 election. Okay, so our electors looked and said, okay, the 3 votes from Montana will all go to Donald Trump because that is what the popular vote in the state said. They said, we want Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. Now, electors could, if they want, say, nope, we don't think he'll do a good job. We want to vote for Hillary Clinton instead. And there would be nothing stopping them from doing that. And that was kind of the rationale of the electors, is that the electors were viewed by the Founding Fathers as sort of the ejector seat for an election. Because, especially at that time, there was a very real fear that a lot of the people voting, and remember, we're just talking white males here, and in the case of some states like South Carolina, only white landowning males could vote at the beginning. But the idea for the electors was they would be able to say, ooh, you people in that chunk of the state made a very bad decision. We think you voted for the wrong reason, or we think you're ill-informed. Maybe they were just straight up illiterate, which was a real issue at the time, or they hadn't heard, the latest news right before the election. And the electors could then say, nope, you guys made a bad decision. You voted for candidate X. I am instead going to vote for candidate Y because I think that's what's best for everybody. Now, that's still what we have, but this idea of a faithless elector, as you'll hear about it, has sort of gone away. Some people have said that if I win, or if the candidate wins rather, I won't be voting for them. So some states like Washington have actually put into effect where you can fine electors, faithless electors, up to like $5,000 for essentially voting against the will of the people. Which begs the question, if you can do that, what is the point of the Electoral College as opposed to a popular vote anymore? And we talked about this earlier in the year. The answer is that it's the only way little states like ours, little population-wise obviously, have any sort of input on a presidential election. Otherwise, you could basically have it down to 5 states and you would have a majority vote. So, the idea is to keep the ill-informed populace from electing poorly qualified presidents, but it ends up becoming just like an extra step in the popular vote. It's never used in its intended fashion, which, like I said earlier, could be viewed as a good thing, could be viewed as a bad thing. That's up to you. I wouldn't have been happy with John Taylor as my president. Sorry, John Tyler as president. Zachary Taylor, good president. John Tyler, terrible president. Anyway, let's keep moving. So, ratification. How are we going to pass the Constitution? It's going to end up being sort of an argument between the philosophies shown by these 2 guys, Alexander Hamilton on your left, Thomas Jefferson on your right. So, first of all, let's look at the Federalists because, spoiler alert, they win. Headed up by 3 gentlemen, James Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton. John Jay we don't hear about as much because John Jay does not play a major role in American history really after this. He's the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but he actually leaves the job to go be governor of New York instead. But very bright gentleman. So, here's what the Federalists want. They want a strong government. They saw what a weak central government was going to do thanks to the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want that again. So they want to make the nation as a whole strong. They don't want individual states to be incredibly strong. They want the collective of the states to be incredibly strong. They want to avoid more Shays' rebellions where something gets out of hand and no other states can step in. And they are really going to run with Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Locke, who we talked about earlier. So remember, that idea of the will of the people being heard, a separation of powers between various branches of government, in our case is judicial, legislative, and executive, and the will of the people to be, like I said earlier, just a second ago, heard. That's the big thing here, that they're going to follow that common will so everyone's voice gets out there, or at least the majority of the voice gets out there. They also want a judiciary that will be able to provide laws nationwide as opposed to each state making up its own rules and there being no real national rules. So the idea there is that you will have an actual national judiciary, which will make things run far more smoothly. If somebody breaks a law in one state, they can't just hop, skip, and jump over to another state and be like, we're fine now. So they want to increase the rule of law here. They need the ability to tax at a federal level. Remember, the biggest missed opportunity or biggest mistake of the Articles of Confederation was that they did not have the ability to actually collect taxes. They could ask for taxes, but that was it. They want to be able to fund a national military to defend themselves. They want to basically be able to pay to make the government go, as opposed to just sort of putting their hand out and saying, please, states, could you give us some money so we could do stuff for all of you? Because that's not what was happening under the Articles of Confederation, is the states were all like, yeah, figure it out yourselves. We, South Carolina, are perfectly happy. Why would we give money to help out New York? So this ability to tax is going to be a big, 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 big thing. I cannot stress that enough. Because the ability to tax is also going to give us money. By giving us money, we're able to pay off the debts that we owe to the French and other countries that we took loans from during the American Revolution. Now, that does not sound like a super fun thing, as yay, we get to pay back our debts. But by doing that, we show that the U.S. is a trustworthy country and therefore is a country that you can do business with. And America is a country that is on the come up, very rich in natural resources, and is starting to build factories, like small factories, but factories. So we need places to sell that. And if we're not trustworthy, that's not going to work anymore. So this ability to pay taxes is going to balloon to be a major benefit that Alexander Hamilton is going to fight absolutely tooth and nail for through this entire ratification process, and he will be victorious. And then lastly, I mentioned it up there with Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Locke, but that idea of checks and balances, that we won't have a tyrant, we won't have a too powerful judiciary, we won't have a too powerful legislative branch, because each branch is going to keep the other one in check and make sure that the will of the people is what is important and not the will of people sitting in a specific branch of government. Now, on the other side, we've got the anti-federalists. We've got Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, remember Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, that guy, George Mason of university fame and occasional NCAA basketball upset, and Light Horse Harry Lee here, who is Robert E. Lee's dad. So, what's going on here? These guys are very afraid of a monarchy or a tyranny. They don't think that the Federalist Plan is good enough. They think that putting too much power at the national level by splitting up the country from a confederal to a federal system is going to pull the power away from the people and deprive the people of their voice. That would be bad. They also feel is that taxation is going to economically exploit the people, that it is going to just keep sucking money away from the populace until they have no more money and the government has all of it. And then the people will have to hold out their hands to the government and say, hey, please help us. So that's another thing they're afraid of. They're also afraid, in the very same vein of that taxation being too powerful and the monarchy, so in our case, the presidency or the legislative branch being too powerful, is that a strong judiciary would be so powerful that it would erase state laws and make state judiciaries absolutely useless. Long story short, by making a big government, they're afraid that that government is going to lose sight of the people that it represents and only worry about the biggest groups, leaving the little man behind. And they don't want that. So the little man could be the little man like, small rural folk, or it could be a smaller state like Rhode Island. So these guys are very much in favor of that confederal, let us kind of deal with our own stuff, and maybe we'll let, a national government do a little bit of negotiating for us. But these guys are really into that idea of confederacy, and each state gets to call its own shots. A very libertarian viewpoint, if we kind of think back to the political compass from earlier in the year. So, what happens next? Most states get on board with the federal model, but Massachusetts has an issue. They say that there's nowhere in the text of the Constitution proper that spells out what the rights of the people are. They instead just explain what powers the national government has. And so the Constitutional Congress says, okay, here's what we're going to do. If we write up a Bill of Rights that specifically spell out what you, the people, are entitled to, so it can't be taken away by a federal government later on, will you sign this? And everybody agrees yes. So as soon as the Constitution is ratified, the first thing that Congress will do immediately is push through a Bill of Rights that will then go out to the states. We'll talk exactly about how the amendment process works later, but this is set so as soon as one happens, as soon as the Constitution happens, then immediately after, the Bill of Rights goes into effect. So other states feel better about this. They're like, okay, there's clearly a plan here that we can work with. So they're going to ratify the Constitution in 1788. Rhode Island is going to wait a little bit, but eventually they will go into it. It doesn't matter because one of the things in the Constitution says that not all states need to ratify the Constitution. So 1789, George Washington is elected unanimously. One person votes against Washington just to prove that they can, but says, like, clearly I would have voted for Washington, but I just want to show that, this isn't a dictatorship. So George Washington's elected president and says, hey, Congress, get on that Bill of Rights. And they do. So the Bill of Rights will be passed right afterwards. And this is all James Madison. The Bill of Rights started out as like 17 or 19 amendments, and it was basically edited down to the 10 with which we're familiar today. But the idea here is liberty in law is what they refer to it as. And I said this on the last slide, but the basic rationale is this. The Constitution spells out the powers of the federal government, but it doesn't spell out what the rights of the people are. And most of the Federalists argue originally that, well, they're automatically entitled to everything that's not in the Constitution because they're the people that are giving us the rights to the Constitution. They're delegating these powers to the federal government. And the Anti-Federalists and some of the people like Massachusetts say, well, that sounds really nice, but, the kings of England said that too, and then they took it away. So is there any way you can guarantee us what our rights are as citizens? And James Madison says, yes, we will give you a specific list of things that you are entitled to as an American citizen that could only be changed by passing another constitutional amendment, which require 3/4 of the states to agree with it. So we are giving you these rights spelled out so they can never be taken away. So they're going to guarantee personal freedom. So that's your first and to a lesser extent, Second Amendment stuff. Due process of law is the 4th through the 8th Amendment. They're also going to guarantee the rights of the states and the rights of the individual. So the 9th Amendment is going to say specifically the people have rights. The 10th Amendment is going to say the states have rights. And this is going to make everybody feel a lot better. So by 1791, the Bill of Rights is passed, and the Constitution, as we think of it, is essentially done. And that's going to wrap it up for this chapter. In a normal year, we would move directly into reading the Constitution after this. This year, we've made a bit of a change. We're still going to do it, obviously. I love talking about the Constitution. It's very interesting. But we will do that later on. So our next unit is going to be on elections and political parties, and we will start that this week. So that's it. You are sort of up to speed, as it were, on how the Constitution and the Bill of Rights get there. And we'll talk about this stuff more later. All right, thanks, folks. If you have any questions, throw them in chat or just ask me in class. Adios.